Welcome to my channel. If you've never visited my channel, my name is Grace and I've been homesteading and canning for over 40 years. Do you ever go to all that trouble of putting all your stuff in your canner and you go through the process, you open up the lid, and then what happened to the water? Sometimes half the water's gone. Why did it siphon out of my jars? There's a lot of reasons why that can happen. Now, I'm only going to tell you what I know from 42, maybe 43 years of canning. There are several reasons why that could happen. One is putting too much water in your jars to start with. For instance, if you're doing vegetables, you need only like a ½ inch headspace from the top. With meats, they tell you 1 inch. But sometimes it depends on how much fat is in your meat. I will normally go 3/4 inch so it allows the fat to rise. The other thing is when you get your jars in your canner and you're adjusting the heat, it comes up to a jiggle. You have to stay with your canner all the time, because if that stops and it lowers the pressure, then your water goes back and forth, up and down in the jars. So if you get the water going too high, the heat going too high, then it starts boiling more. So it starts like siphoning, the water out. So basically what this video is going to be about is how to maintain that mostly the pressure in your canner from the start even to the end. Let's get started. You're going to start with heating your jars up first. I've always done that. Everybody does it different. Maybe I'll get it off. So what I do, because we're going to have to add water to this also, so to sterilize my jars. Now they say you don't have to if you're processing, like this is going to be processing for 1 hour and 30 minutes. I still got hot water to put in the hamburger. It just happened that we just had a cow butchered, so I'm canning hamburger, and I do have a video, I will link it in the description below, about how I do can my hamburger. So it starts with, now since we're doing meat, and hamburger does get greasy, there's a lot of grease, or that fat, fat that would form up in your jar. So like I said, they tell you to fill your jars up to here. But because I'm using hamburger and there is some excess fat, I'm going to fill it just a little bit below. So that way it has room for the fat to, rise and you need to make room for the fat. So first thing we're going to do, and I'll just do 2 jars. Now this will hold 2 cups of cooked hamburger. Now the hamburger that I'm doing here, it's half cooked. Alright, so you can see, and I do tap it down a tad, not much, but it still needs more. Okay, let's do this one. So as you can see, it is not filled up to the rim. I've got it down a little bit more. Now if you have vegetables, then you can fill them up to the rims, and in salsas and certain things. The next step, it's up to you, it's optional. I always put a teaspoon of salt in mine. You do not have to put salt. You can add any seasonings you want to it. So the next thing I will be doing, let me get some of this. Now we're going to fill this up with water. Now the water you do want filled up to the top. I should have got my measuring cup, or my glass one out here. Look. Again, this is the water that I boiled in my jars. Okay. If you can see here, this is the 1 inch from the rim. I have it about maybe 1/4 inch lower than the rim, ½ inch lower. The next thing is we want to get all the air bubbles out. They tell you not to use a knife because it scrapes the sides of the glass. I have been using this same knife for 40 years. I don't take it and scrape it down in, and I've had these jars. These jars are probably, my mom had them beforehand. So I know these jars, I've been using them for 40 years, and there are no scratch marks. But I do not suggest that you do it for first time canning. But this knife, I love it. It gets most of the air bubbles out. So I just go down the side, but if you can look, you can see all the air bubbles. It's so important that you get the air bubbles out of these jars. You just keep going. So I don't know if maybe this knife just doesn't scratch the side, but it doesn't. But just keep going down in here until you do not see any more air bubbles, to the best you can. Like I said, that is the most important thing there is. I'm not talking about these bubbles, because these up here, the foam bubbles, that's what's coming up from the jars. But take your time. Get those bubbles out. I mean, you can use all kinds of things. Some people use chopsticks, but like I said, I've been using the same knife all those years, and my jars are not scratched up. Okay, I do not see any more air bubbles coming out. The next thing I'm going to do is wipe my jars. Again, everybody likes to wipe their jars ever how they want. I have a dish pan with some hot, very mild soapy water, especially when I'm using meat. So you really want to make sure this is off really good. You wipe the rim off, make sure there's no fat drippings on it, or it won't seal. Now the next thing is, you do not have to heat up your lids. This is something I've always done all these years, and I just can't get out of the habit of doing it. Just finger tight. Nothing, not real tight. Because if you get your jar lids too tight, the rings too tight, and it can't expand and do what it needs, this will buckle on you. And so if you ever get a jar that comes out of the canner and it's all like buckled up, that's because you had the ring on too tight. Now before you put your jars in the canner, it's so important that you put in at least 2 inches of water before you put the jars in, because you don't want this canner to run dry. And make sure the water temperature, it's not boiling. I usually put it like, I don't know, like number 4 on my stove for heat, and because these jars are still hot. So I'm going to go ahead and place these jars in the canner. So you remember, see the water, it's not all the way up there. That way it gives room for the fat. And I do have one small one here. Okay. I've been using this canner for over 40 years, and my mother's used it too. I bet you this canner is over 60 years old. So just slide in. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to do, we're going to turn this heat up, not on high, but medium high. It's not necessary to put it on high. Medium high seems to be the best. So we're going to let this pressure build up. And once steam starts coming out, because now you're building your pressure, because you don't want it, like I said, if you get it too hot, then all the liquids start going crazy in there, and that's where I found where a lot of your siphoning comes from out of the jars. So by putting it on a medium-high, slowly build up your pressure. So once this starts steaming, then I'll get back with you and tell you the next step. I want you to hear that pressure coming out. It's going to be hard to see because of the light background on my wall. Once that's coming out pretty strong, now I have the gauge here, or the weight. Once the pressure's up, this is what happens. You hear how loud it is? Now we have to put this under control. So what we're going to do, that's too much. We just want a small jiggle. I can't back here there. We're going to turn it down one number from 7 to 6. And then we'll let it steady. This is kind of what we want here. That's about where we want to maintain it. But we're going to, as it still gets hotter, it still builds pressure, we're still going to have to go back and turn this down. So just let it for a couple minutes do that. And then turn it down. Now we're going from 7 to 6, now 6 to 5. So I'm going to let it sit and do this for a while. When it first starts jiggling, I usually about after 5 minutes of it, where we're trying to lower the pressure, that's when I start my timer. So because of hamburger, it's going to take 1 hour and 30 minutes. So that's when you set your time. But actually this is doing pretty good. Just sits there for a little while. You can get about 4 jiggles a minute, then you know you got it good. Now again, every canner is different. Like that. Alright, the timer went off, so the only thing you do from here, shut it off and walk away. An hour's gone by, so the next thing you want to do is take this off. There's no steam. Now, I see a lot of people take this lid and just throw it up in the air. When you do that, I have seen jars just like poof, and then it just, the lid, it just comes off, flies off. Sometimes the rings get loosened, and if that happens, that ring will fly off, and then there'll be a lot of spray. So because it's hot, there's a lot of pressure, I leave it cracked here. I leave it like this here, so more of the heat and pressure can all come out. The pressure's gone, but it's mostly the heat. And so when that gets done, I'll usually leave it sit for a little bit, for probably about a half hour, and then I'll bring the jars out. After about a half hour, then I remove the lid. I like to let it sit for an hour, and I'll show you why, because everything in there is still bubbling, and the liquid, there's a lot of pressure in there. So just leave it sit for about another hour, then we'll be good to go. And that will help keep your water from siphoning out. As you see down in the canner, like right here, you could see the liquid still bubbling and boiling inside. But if you notice, I didn't lose no liquid. After leaving it sit for about another half hour, I lift them up slow, because sometimes the bottoms will break out of them. Then you got a mess everywhere. You can see all the bubbles. That's a lot of pressure in there. If I would open that lid now and take that lid off, that would just fly up in the air. But if you noticed, I have all my liquid in my jars. Take your time with canning. It takes time. It's a lot of work for you to get to this part of the canning. And it's nothing like to pull out your jars and then you got about half a jar full of liquid, which is not going to hurt to have that. But if you go through the process and take your time and build the heat up like I showed you, you shouldn't have a problem with the water siphoning out. Now I'm going to show you the inside of my canner. Inside that canner, there's no meat juice in there. Might look a little on the greasy side a little bit, but none of the meat, none of the juice siphoned out of my jars. Every canner is different. get to know your canner personally and get to know what it takes for your canner. Now, what might have worked for me here that I showed you might not be exactly what would work for you. But the whole idea was to just build your pressure up slow. And this is the result. All right, guys, take care.